All right, everybody, gather around. The Candyman is here. Now, what kind of candy you want? Sweet chocolate, chocolate malt candy, gumdrops, anything you want. You've come to the right man because I'm the Candyman.
I'm in Beverly Hills, California, standing on North Bedford Street, and the building behind me is 450. In this building, the 3rd day of September, 1971, the Watergate escapade began here. Up on the 2nd floor, room 212, was the office of Dr. Lewis Fielding. 9 o'clock that morning, G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt showed up here to case the joint. They wanted to see the layout of Dr. Fielding's office. Dr. Lewis Fielding was the psychiatrist for Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg had been a Marine. In 1962, he went to Harvard, got his PhD economics, and he went to work for the RAND Corporation, which is research and development for the federal government. It's located in Santa Monica, just a few miles away. He got an assignment to review all of the documents that created the history of the Vietnam War and how the United States got involved. President Johnson wanted this study done so that he could take the documents, make them appear that it was President Kennedy who was responsible for getting us deeply involved in Vietnam. It was President Kennedy who ordered 1,000 soldiers to come home from Vietnam by Christmas of 1963, and the remaining 15,000 soldiers to come home from Vietnam in 1964. Lyndon Johnson wanted this task done so that he could make it appear that John F. Kennedy was responsible for getting us into Vietnam. This went on for several years until 1968, Daniel Ellsberg decided that he was against the Vietnam War after he saw all of these documents. He copied 20,000 documents, took them home, and took them eventually to the New York Times, which began to publish them on June 13, 1971. This is my copy of the Pentagon Papers. I bought this copy in June of 1972 when I was in the Army. And I was reading this in the office one day when there was nothing to do because we were waiting for a plane load of new soldiers to come over to interview them and assign them to the units. The officer in charge got very mad seeing me read this in the office. Everybody else went out to go to the movies. They went out to go get something to eat. They went shopping, and he told me, go out and go shopping, go to the movies, but don't read that here in the office. I said, why not? I said, I just want to learn about what's going on. He said, it's a civilian book. We don't read the civilian books in an Army office. If you want to read something, read an Army book. He said, if you don't put that away, I'm going to send you to an infantry unit. The next day, he caught me reading it again. Nothing to do, there was nobody around. He said the same thing to me. I said to him, don't threaten me, just do it. And he did it. But it turned out to be the best thing to happen to me in the Army. Looking back now, if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been able to finish up my college degree. My last year of college, I only had 4 credit hours to go when I got drafted out of John Carroll. But it was all because of this book. So it worked out well. But this book started in the building behind me at 450 North Bedford Street in Beverly Hills, California, where the Watergate episode all began. E. Howard Hunt, Bernard Barker, Eugenio Martinez. They led this group with 2 more Cuban recruits from the Bay of Pigs, from the Kennedy assassination, and now on to the Watergate conspiracy. It all began in this building. On the 2nd floor of this building, up here behind me, was Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis Fielding, in room 212. We're going to go up there in a little while. We're going to go into the office. Bernard Barker, Eugenio Martinez, G. Gordon Liddy, and 1 other Cuban, D. Diego, came here to break into that office. And they wanted to make sure that on the night of September 3rd, Dr. Lewis Fielding was at home. So E. Howard Hunt went out to his home, sat in the car, and made sure he never left the house. G. Gordon Liddy walked up and down the street, drove around here, and made sure that the police weren't going to come into the building. But upstairs, Bernard Barker, who was one of the Watergate conspirators, along with E. Howard Hunt, and who worked on the Bay of Pigs invasion with E. Howard Hunt. They broke into the office. They pried open the filing cabinet in room 212, Dr. Fielding's office. And they went through and photographed all of the records that pertained to Daniel Ellsberg. They wanted to make him appear to be a psychiatric mess, a guy who didn't know what he was doing. 9 months later, on June 17, 1972, the same group of men who fought at the Bay of Pigs and engineered the Bay of Pigs, who were central figures in the assassination of President Kennedy, the same group of burglars from the plumbers unit, they got permission to accomplish this burglary from the White House. Halderman, who was Richard Nixon's chief of staff, and Ehrlichman, Richard Nixon's assistant in charge of domestic affairs, they sanctioned this break-in. They sanctioned whatever these plumbers were doing. Broke into an office down that center hall towards the end, one of the last sets of windows on the second floor. Nobody saw them. A cleaning lady came in, and E. Howard Hunt said, he spoke in Spanish, as he was well versed in Spanish, you'd have to be for the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he said, I'm a doctor, so he was allowed to be there. But he was walking up and down the street during the day taking pictures, encasing the joint, while disguised as an old lady, in a dress and a wig and a hat. Nobody recognized him. He was a master of disguise. There's no way we could prove it. There's no way he can be seen, because he had government-sanctioned disguises. They spared no expense. E. Howard Hunt drove out to Dr. Fielding's house, sat out in front of the house in a car to make sure that Dr. Fielding didn't leave his house and come back to his office that night at 9 o'clock when the plumbers were breaking in. G. Gordon Liddy was driving around the block the whole night to make sure that while the men were upstairs, no police were going to be alerted and come into the building. And they had walkie-talkies. They would have been alerted, and they would have gotten out of that building really quick if the cops were on their way. So this was all planned out. Richard Nixon knew about it. Everybody was happy. They were going to make Daniel Ellsberg appear to be some kind of a nut. Lone nuts are how we do everything in this country. That's how we assassinate Bobby Kennedy. We assassinated John Kennedy, attempted to assassinate Governor Wallace, and Martin Luther King. All one lone nut. And Daniel Ellsberg was going to be portrayed as a lone nut. Daniel Ellsberg knew that the war in Vietnam was nothing but a charade. It was nothing but a put-on. And he was focusing his attention on the documents that were created by Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, President Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover, and the CIA. It was a big party for the military and for LBJ to help out his friends, Kellogg, Brown, and Root in Texas. Now, there was another war that was put on by another president from Texas for his friends at Halliburton. His vice president was from Halliburton, Richard Cheney. So Dick Cheney's president, George W. Bush, one of the dumbest chimpanzees to ever occupy the Oval Office, not counting Donald Trump and not counting Gerald Ford, but he was nothing more than somebody who was positioned to start a war over weapons of mass destruction, which never even existed. Down this alley, on the second floor, the unit before the end was Dr. Lewis Fielding's office. The plumber's unit broke into the second floor office, which is right above me here, where the lights are on, right here. And this is where they broke in to the back above that window. They were able to pry open with a crowbar the file drawers, searching for Daniel Ellsberg's records. They took them out, they photographed all the pages and put them back, but they made a shambles of his office. So it was obvious somebody had broken in. And then when they arrived the next morning and found that, they searched for what had been mishandled, what had been abused, and what had been strewn about. And it was the records of Daniel Ellsberg. That occurred on September 3rd, 1971 at 9 o'clock at night. September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June. We're talking 9.5 months later, the same group of people engineered and choreographed and broke into the Watergate in Washington, D.C. Democratic National Headquarters, doing the same type of espionage, searching for documents to try to find out illegally what the Democratic National Party is doing. They wanted to know their every move, all of their operations, all of their operatives, what's coming next, their schedules, everything. They wanted to be one step ahead. Richard Nixon could not risk losing this election in 1972. He worked so hard to get the election won in 1968. You have to remember, they shot Martin Luther King, they shot Robert F. Kennedy, and in 1972, they shot George Wallace. Richard Nixon was the same president as Lyndon Johnson when it came to the Vietnam War, and that's why he was put into office. Nothing could be more important than keeping that war going because it meant billions for KB&R. Now let's go upstairs and we'll get into that office and we'll see where they broke in. At 9 o'clock that night, the three Cubans, Bernard Barker, Eugenio Martinez, and one more, came up the stairs while E. Howard Hunt was out at Dr. Fielding's house to make sure that he wasn't leaving the house and coming to the office, and while G. Gordon Liddy was circling the block to make sure that no cops were alerted to what was going on in room 212. Now let's take a walk down the hall to room 212, and we're going to go in the office where they broke in that night and stole the records. This is the back of Dr. Fielding's office. The office wasn't that big. There was a little reception area up front, and then the office extended over into the next suite. This is where they pried open the filing cabinet. See the damage they did to it. So it was very obvious when Dr. Fielding came in the next morning of September 4th. Somebody had been in his office because everything was thrown all about. Things are on the floor, and the drawers are obviously locked, and they were broken open. This was the beginning of the sequence of events that led up to Richard Nixon's resignation. I'm going to take you back to Washington, D.C., and we're going to see the involvement of Deep Throat, how it happened, how it was portrayed in the movie All the President's Men, and how it became such a big part of American history. But it all started right here in the attempt to blame the Vietnam involvement on President Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson knew when he began this task of going through all the documents and having this history created, that if he could skew the evidence like he did in the assassination of President Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, they could create the evidence and they could make it say whatever they wanted to, regardless of the true facts. The facts were not going to get in the way of their political goals. Let's go to Washington, D.C. I'm on. This is the cabinet that was broken into on the night of September 3rd, 1971 in Dr. Fielding's office at North Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills. It was brought here to the National Archives 52 years ago. It's been on display here for the last several years. You can see at the top, you can see where they broke in with a crowbar, where E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy engineered the break-in to get to Daniel Ellsberg's medical record. I want you to come with me to a rather secluded spot just outside of Washington, D.C. that very few people know about, but you're going to get to see. Let's go. I'm in parking spot 32D at 1401 Nash Street in Rosslyn, Virginia. Across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. In this spot, Mark Felt, better known as Deep Throat, the Associate Director of the FBI in 1973 and 1974, met with Bob Woodward of the famous journalistic team Woodward and Bernstein. They were writing stories for the Washington Post relating to the Watergate break-in, which occurred June 17, 1972. Mark Felt had secret information information that only the FBI possessed relating to the involvement of Richard Nixon in that break-in. He provided that information to Bob Woodward in this spot. He came forward.
You let Haldeman slip away?
Yes.
You've done worse than let Haldeman slip away, get people feeling sorry for him. I didn't think that was possible. In a conspiracy like this, you build from the outer edges and you go step by step. If you shoot too high and miss, everybody feels more secure. You put the investigation back months.
Yes, we know that. And if we're wrong, we're resigning. Were we wrong?
You'll have to find that out, won't you?
Listen, I'm tired of your chicken shit games. I don't want hints. I need to know what you know.
It was a Haldeman operation. The whole business was run by Haldeman, the money, everything. It won't be easy getting at him. He was insulated. You'll have to find out how. Mitchell started doing covert stuff before anyone else. The list is longer than anyone can imagine. It involves the entire U.S. intelligence community. FBI. CIA, justice. It's incredible. Cover-up had little to do with Watergate. It was mainly to protect the covert operations. It leads everywhere. Get out your notebook. There's more. Your lives are in danger.
From that, Richard Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974. What brought down the presidency was the involvement of Mark Felt and Woodward and Bernstein, exposing corruption at the highest level of American government.
Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office. As he assumes that responsibility, he will deserve the help and the support of all.
Downstairs. There is the man who will be president in another couple of hours, Gerald Ford and his wife, Betty Ford.
Vice President Ford this morning, as he left his home to come here for this occasion, said it was indeed one of the saddest incidents that he's ever seen. And there's the president waving goodbye, and you hear the applause.
President Nixon's helicopter going over the fountains of the White House South Lawn.
Woodward and Bernstein took this information to Sam Ervin and the Senate subcommittee, which was conducting hearings on the Nixon administration.
Mr. Colson instructed me to become the White House resident expert on the origins of the Vietnam War. At the same time, I had a collateral responsibility for determining certain leaks of highly classified information, which included the leaks of the Pentagon Papers.
Now, is it true, Mr. Hunt, that From the beginning of your employment, Mr. Colson asked you to collect what could be called derogatory information about Daniel Ellsberg.
Yes.
Would it be also fair to say that one of the purposes of the conversation was to get information from Colonel Kineen which might be derogatory against Dr. Ellsberg?
One of the purposes, yes, sir.
Would it be fair to say that there was at least an inquiry being made as to attempt to connecting Mr. Ellsberg with drug trafficking?
Yes, sir.
Which will show an effort by Mr. Colson to try to discredit the Kennedy administration and therefore the Democratic Party during the election and relating it to the assassination of Premier Diem and for that purpose attempting to bring the Catholic vote away from the Democratic Party and to show that a Democratic president had a role in the assassination of a Catholic premier. Did you in fact fabricate cables for the purpose of indicating the relationship of the Kennedy administration and the assassination of Diem?
I did.
And did you show these fabricated cables to Mr. Colson?
I did.
What was his response to the fabricated cables?
He indicated to me that he would be probably getting in touch with a member of the media, of the press, to whom he would show the cables.
And were you in fact put in touch with a member of the media?
I was.
And who was that?
Mr. William Lambert of Life magazine. I believe it was desired by Mr. Colson, or at least some of his colleagues, to demonstrate that a Catholic United States administration had in fact conspired in the assassination of a Catholic chief of state in another country.
There is a reference to obtain Ellsberg's files from a psychiatrist analyst. Do you see that reference as one of the items?
I do.
Did you, at the time you made that recommendation, contemplate that it might be necessary to engage in a covert entry or a break-in?
I did.
Was it subsequently determined that an attempt should be made to obtain Dr. Ellsberg's medical files from the psychiatrist's office?
Yes, sir.
You have a memorandum which the committee provided you dated August 27, 1971, from Mr. Ehrlichman to Charles Colson, with the subject Hunt Liddy Special Project Number 1.
I have such a memorandum.
This is from Mr. Ehrlichman to Mr. Colson, on the assumption that the proposed undertaking by Hunt and Liddy would be carried out and would be successful. I would appreciate receiving from you by next Wednesday a game plan as to how and when you believe the material should be used. This referring to Hunt Liddy Special Project Number 1.
The fact that Mr. Liddy and I, as of that date, would just have returned from our initial reconnaissance of Dr. Fielding's professional premises in Beverly Hills.
Liddy Special Project Number 1 would refer to the proposed covert entry of Dr. Fielding's office for the psychiatric file.
Yes.
You and Mr. Liddy and 3 Cuban Americans, Mr. Barker, Mr. Martinez, and Mr. Diego, did break into Dr. Fielding's office over the Labor Day weekend in 1971. Is that true?
With one limitation, that neither Mr. Liddy or I were ever in the premises of Dr. Fielding. I obtained Mr. Barker's cooperation, and he obtained the cooperation of Messrs. Martinez and De Diego.
What was your prior relationship with Mr. Barker?
Mr. Barker had assisted me during the CIA-sponsored effort, which came to be known as the Bay of Pigs operation. On Labor Day weekend 1971, that is to say the 3rd of September, the entry in Dr. Fielding's office was accomplished. The following Tuesday, that is to say the first working day after Labor Day, was the morning on which I attempted to show Mr. Colson the Polaroid photographs that have been taken by team members of the violated cabinets in Dr. Fielding's premises. I spoke to Mr. O'Brien at some length about the size and nature of the legal bills. I think at that time they amounted to approximately $60,000. I told him at the same time that I was very much concerned about the future of my family, that I would very much like to have the equivalent of 2 years' subsistence available to them before I was incarcerated, that incarceration being due within a very short period of time. And I put it to Mr. O'Brien that I had engaged, as he might or might not know, in other activities which I believe I described as seamy activities for the White House. I don't believe that I specified them. However, I did make reference to them, and the context of such reference was that if anyone was to receive benefits at that time, in view of my long and loyal service, if not hazardous service for the White House, that certainly I should receive priority consideration.
Would Mr. O'Brien be able at least to draw an inference from his part that because of the so-called seamy activities you said that you engaged on behalf of the White House, that if you weren't paid this sum of money, that these may become public? Mr. Mitchell and a number of others believed that there was considerable pressure being placed by you at that time for money, and that the danger of not paying you was that there might be some public exposure of a seamy matter. In fact, Mr. Ehrlichman testified that there was a blackmail threat. So the question put to you was, did you intend, by telling Mr. O'Brien that one, the $60,000 had to be paid, and two, you had engaged in certain other seamy matters on behalf of the White House, did you intend to create that threat that unless that money was paid, you would make public the acts that you had engaged on behalf of the White House?
No, sir.
Now, how did Mr. O'Brien respond to you when you asked for this money?
Well, it was more than simply a question of asking for money, Mr. Dash. It was really my first opportunity to catalog the many difficulties that we had, that is to say my late wife principally, and to some extent myself, in finding the means to defend ourselves that had been promised us as long ago as the previous June 21st. I paid Mr. Bittman $60,000 that derived from the proceeds of my late wife's insurance policies.
I heard the plane, and then it sounded like a bomb exploded. And then I just ran. He was dragging.
A survivor of one of Chicago's worst aviation disasters relives a nightmare. In a few weeks, we'll mark the 50th anniversary of the crash of United Airlines Flight 553, which slammed into a residential neighborhood just south of Midway Airport.
Well, a day in 1972, it was December 8th. It was 2:30 in the afternoon.
We met Tom Wydra at the corner of 71st and Hamlin, where 50 years ago he and some buddies were in a car headed to the mall, when suddenly the West Lawn neighborhood shook with a tremendous roar.
We hear a loud roar of a jet engine that was something we never heard before. And all of a sudden you hear a giant thump, and we yell out, a plane just crashed.
Record for the airplane crash at 70 Place in Lawndale. Plan 3 is now in effect.
United Airlines Flight 553, carrying 61 people, had fallen out of the sky, slamming into the 3700 block of West 70th Place, about 2 miles southeast of Midway Airport, where it was trying to land. 43 people on the plane and 2 people on the ground were killed. Amazingly, 18 people on the plane survived.
There used to be 53 people in this plane. We don't know how many are in the hospital.
And I heard the plane approach, and he got louder and louder, and he sounded like he was in takeoff mode.
Evan Cotter had just arrived home from 8th grade and was changing in his bedroom when the plane slammed into his family's brick bungalow.
After that, everything in the house went horizontal. Bricks flew through the house, broken glass. There were pieces of airplane in the house. My mother was in the kitchen at the time, and she said she saw the tail of the plane go on by.
Cotter still lives on the block.
This is my house next door. There's a big section of wing. It hit the back of the house, and it got sheared off.
In a house that was rebuilt after the crash.
I called out for my mother. I found her in the house. We ran to the front of the house, and We looked out the door and we could see, the only thing we could see was the tail sticking out of the house across the street.
The flight had originated in Washington, D.C. and was headed to Omaha with a stop in Chicago. It was a cold and wet day with clouds just 500 feet above the ground. Controllers at Midway told the pilots to do a go-around to avoid a slower plane in front of them. The pilots circled around, but forgot that they had lowered the spoilers on the wings, creating too much drag and eventually causing the plane to stall.
Witnesses say that he came out of the clouds and he was like this, but then the plane started going like this, and then it was like this, and then boom, it hit.
NTSB investigators determined the crash was caused by the captain's failure to exercise positive flight management, essentially pilot error. But many believe the crash was part of a nefarious political plot because of this passenger.
Dorothy Hunt happened to be the spouse of E. Howard Hunt, one of the people being investigated for the Watergate break-in.
E. Howard Hunt was one of the so-called plumbers who broke into the Watergate Hotel to bug Democratic offices on behalf of President Richard Nixon.
I just got a terribly tragic bit of news. That plane crash, Howard Hunt's wife was on it. And his wife is dead? Yes, sir. She was killed in that plane crash in Chicago. Oh, my God.
1969 and continue to be employed until March 14 of this year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
You were fired from your job as head of the Federal Aviation Administration by President Ford. When?
In March 31st of 1975. I was there 2 years and two weeks.
Now, we've heard varying stories as to why you were fired. There are those who will even say that there was a vendetta against you in the Ford administration because you were the guy who, forgive me, blew the whistle on the tapes. You believe that for some reason Mr. Nixon out in San Clemente was saying to Jerry Ford, look, get rid of Butterfield.
Well, I think Al Haig may have relayed the message, but...
What?
I say Al Haig may have been the one to relay the message, but I think there were certain understandings there that, including the pardon and including some other things, and I'm sure of this.
Mr. Butterfield, you were satisfied in your own mind that President Nixon knew about the Watergate break-in ahead of time.
I said before the judiciary that nothing happened at that White House, and I do mean nothing, without the president's knowledge. And I think for something of that magnitude to have been scheduled as a break-in of the Democratic headquarters, of course the president had to know about it. It made me sick at heart, really, when I learned about the corruption of principle that existed at the pinnacle of government. And there's a lot of it. There is a surprising lack of real honest-to-God personal integrity in the higher levels of government.
You've come to the right man because I'm the candy man.